Now we'll change gear a little bit, and I would invite Carolyn Dimitri, our keynote speaker. She'll look at these issues we've been discussing from the point of view of an economist. Her work explores how food systems are related to important social issues: human health, environmental sustainability, and consumer access equity in terms of prices along the supply chain. She's worked for the USDA as an economist. Right now, she's at NYU as a visiting professor. And today's her talk is Reimagining the Food System. Please welcome Carolyn Dimitri.
I will just put some structure on the conversation and give you some idea about how an economist, a researcher, an academic would think about this. Because I think there's room for all of us in this movement. And I had a very funny thing to say, but I don't remember what it is now. It was the light. It's floored me. Sorry about that. So I must confess, most of my research has been on organic food. I'm a true advocate for organic food, and this idea of food systems is kind of new. It's really something that I've really started thinking about since I joined the NYU faculty in September. So a lot of my ideas are rough, but you have to start somewhere. And so the place I'm going to take you might not be a place you want to go. But I think in order to talk about how to reimagine our food system, we need to take a good look at our current food system and understand how it came to have that structure, what it brings to us as we think about different ways to reframe our food system. So this is a kind of awfully complicated system where you have a farm where our food is produced, and then there are all these different paths our food can take, and ultimately at the end, food is eaten by us. And if you, I won't go through this in a huge amount of detail, but there are places where we have products being transformed, either packaged, manufactured, processed, and products, can go through several stages before they actually, hit your stomach. But if you look at every stage, there is some type of distributor, a broker, distributor, a wholesaler. So food has to somehow get from the farm to the consumer. And just what happens to the food on the way from the farm to consumer, we might not always support it, but this is basically the way our world is working now. And so most of our conversation today has talked about this top, shorter supply chain where things are going from the farm to consumers or retailers or directly to restaurants. But most of our food travels through these complicated production systems, distribution and marketing systems. And as an economist, I like to think about the social problems that are related to our current food system, and there are many. And probably the most significant one is in terms of environmental degradation. The impact of how our food is raised on the environment is pretty well documented with soil erosion, water damage to water bodies, damage to soil, damage to wildlife, climate change, loss of biodiversity. So the list, is pretty enormous. And even though different types of conservation practices and other methodologies have been adopted to try to slow down the degradation of the environment, I feel that at least in this country, serious steps have not really been taken to minimize the damage at this point of the supply chain. In the end, we saw food goes through this complex market system. In the end, we do end up with food that's really of questionable quality. What is it that we're eating? When you go in the grocery store, 80% of the products there, I would not even consider food. And this is what people eat, and it has an impact upon human health. And you can look and see 66% of the population is overweight and obese. There are all sorts of health, heart disease, diabetes, the list goes on. And maybe we're starting to see progress in taking that and linking it to the quality of the food we eat. But I feel like it's not really moving at a fast enough pace. And something that we've talked about a fair amount today is our food system does not really reward farmers. It's hard to make a living as a farmer in this country. People don't want to pay a lot for their food, and farmers struggle. And then the last, which is something that also has been mentioned here, is there really is a disconnect in our mind between the food we eat and the farm that it comes from. And so to me, these are the way I like to frame the problems that have emerged in our society as a result of how our food is produced. And so I'm an economist, so I like to think about things like market power. So if we look at the food supply chain, we see that in the US, there are 2.2 million farms. And then we're going to move along through this wholesaler chain. So we have about 34,000 wholesalers, 26,000 manufacturers. So you have very few firms buying from these farms. And so because they have this market power, farmers receive a pretty low price for the products that they raise when it goes through the traditional channels. And then the retailers, about 151,000 in the country, but if you take a look around different cities, there's a fair amount of concentration by cities. So retailers also have a fair amount of power in setting prices consumers pay. And so we can see at the two ends of the supply chain, we have like a lot of people buying and a lot of farmers producing. And we have this squeeze in the middle with these firms. Those are our big agribusiness firms that have a significant amount of market power. So we have winners and we have losers. I think one thing that comes out of this is that the size matters. Winners are the big farms and the big corporations, and consumers are winners in a sense because they don't pay very much for their food. One of my jokes is we have big people too, which may not be a winner. And the losers clearly are small and medium-sized farms in this country, farmers that are trying to run farms at that scale. And consumers lose because the variety of products available are greatly limited by those firms in the middle. The quality is determined by the firms in the middle. And there are a wide range of consumers that just have no access to food. And so now when we bring this into our discussion today, which is how do you link local producers and urban buyers, it sort of sets up kind of a bleak situation that if you wanted to go through traditional markets, you need large scale. You need really uniform quality of product, and you need to have, maybe just a few different types of products. So the traditional markets are essentially closed to local and regional production. And you might think that's good, but I would argue that that is not good for society overall. But I do think what we're seeing is a renaissance in food markets. There are signs, right? Consumers are interested. Everyone here is interested. You have new producers entering the farm sector. Beginning farmers are defined as people who have been farming for less than 10 years. We have one of them in this room, maybe more. And beginning farmers, so they make up a quarter of all farmers. They're younger on average, more likely to be women, and they usually farm on a smaller farm compared to the average farm in the US. And so we've seen these individual movements, and I am a supporter of individual movements, but I'm also a supporter of how do we get from the individual movement to a broader scale, and I think this is the question that we're all asking at this point in time. And I think another question that people have alluded to is as we go from individual to broader scale, how do you maintain that integrity and those important characteristics? How do you keep the local food, regional food movement from, industrializing, for lack of a better word? Restaurants are a huge part of this individual movement. We had someone from the Farm to Chef program that actually set up the Farm to Chef program here. Farm to school movements are, booming all around the country. We have farmers markets, the CSA model, cooperatives. I really wanted to meet the guy from Organic Valley. That's one of the cooperatives I really admire for the things they've done. They've really managed to keep their farmers earning reasonable prices, fair prices. And I don't think, not all organic dairy producers have been that successful. Tuscarora Organic, and then retailers in the DC area, and I don't know, there might be a comparable store here. My Organic Market is a small chain that really works actively with local growers in the DC area. So you see, these are different places along the supply chain. We have a lot of players involved in this market. So it's spreading around. But that brings me to the next question is how do we make this work on a larger scale? And I will just tell you straight up is I don't have the answer to that. If I had the answer to that, I would feel really happy, but I don't. And the question is a larger scale necessary? And I think, yes, a larger scale is necessary. If you're thinking about these issues like environmental quality, human health, farmer well-being. Well, that would argue that the more retail sales or the more sales we had in this system, the better off people along this, alternative supply chain would be. So I'm an advocate for a larger scale, and I think we've pretty much shown that the bottleneck here is distribution. Retail markets, I think, are poorly established. I feel like especially in New York. I mean, New York is probably way ahead of other cities in this area. The farmers markets are thriving here. I don't know if they are thriving quite to this degree in other cities. And CSAs, I think are, a really good movement. But I would really like to see the retailing take place in more venues than just these particular venues. So we have this interest at the farm end and the consumer end, and it's how do we bring the distribution channels up. And I think that there will be large gains that can be realized by developing these distribution systems. And so, this is how far I've gotten in my thinking is, what are the critical elements of our successful model? And then people have talked about this as well today. Farmers have to make a good living doing this. And not only farmers, but people who are taking that raw product and adding value to it as it moves along the supply chain. Because the farmer shouldn't have to do all of that. And just the way the person who's the co-packer here was saying, it's nice that there are these small businesses that farmers can sell their product to, they can add value to it and move it along to the next stage of the supply chain. And the model that's successful will really reduce the cost of these one-to-one transactions. So a farmer's market is costly. It's costly in terms for the consumer. It's probably a little less costly because you have so many farmers markets, so many vendors in one particular farmer's market, especially if you're thinking of, like, say, the Union Square market. But for a farmer, that's a costly thing to do. I mean, you spend all that time in the market, and in some cases, you might be better off spending your time differently, maybe by taking all of your product and merging it with other people's products and having it shipped along that way. But I think that is an individual choice of a farmer about how they want to spend their time and how they want to make their money. But I think at this point in time, probably options outside of these direct sales are not quite, they're not as readily available as direct sales. And so the successful model will have products that people want to buy, and they'll take place in profit-making endeavors, not in nonprofits. And I spent some time looking at urban agriculture farms in New York, and I was disappointed to see that pretty much all of them exist because they're nonprofits. And for this to work, people have to make money. Now, I still think that means there is a role for policy or grants or other kinds of support to get businesses started up and running. That's kind of like a premise of what it's like to be an American, right? You can, take out a small business loan or get some startup money and you can get your business up and running. So it's not that there needs to be this, everything has to happen in the free market, but at some point in time, these markets have to become self-sustaining, and every person along the supply chain has to be making a good living. So I'm so surprised I didn't hear anyone say this word today. This is like the new buzzword, the regional food hub. And the regional food hub is a great idea. And I think maybe the Wholesome Wave people are the first ones that really started promoting this notion of a regional food hub. It's kind of a fuzzy notion, but the idea is that there's a place to aggregate, distribute, store products. And so I think of it as, you have a bunch of producers bringing something, maybe value is added, and then it shoots off the other side someplace. And so what it does is it allows the firms that participate to take advantage of scale economies that you really can't do as an individual buyer or as an individual seller. And the nice thing about the regional food hub is you could bring in whatever kind of mission you want. If you want to be promoting farm viability, or if you want to target richer people, or if you are interested in targeting people that don't have access to food, if you want to build community. I mean, you have a lot of flexibility in how you set up these regional food hubs. And so this is Kathleen Merrigan. I don't know how many people are like food policy wonks, but Kathleen Merrigan is like the goddess of all things sustainable and local and organic. And she's the Deputy Secretary of Agriculture, and so she's snuck in all of these little efforts, and one thing that she has in place now is this study of food hubs, regional food hubs in the US. And so a group of people did this survey of 100 food hubs, and what they found, clusters in the Northeast and the Midwest. They are been in business for less than 5 years. A lot of them are nonprofits, about a third of them. And some interesting preliminary work that's come out of this group is that they've identified 3 critical needs, and every person on the panels has already mentioned these critical needs. How do you get startup capital? How do you get working capital? And how do you train people, to be able to support a business as it grows? And so this is, here's the cool thing, is now you have USDA recognizing these and then seeing, oh, these are the capital needs. And so I predict, and this is just my prediction based upon my experience of having spent a fair amount of time at USDA. I think in the next year or two, you'll see grant programs coming out to build up, to get grant money to develop infrastructure for regional food hubs. So hopefully in 2 years, we'll meet back here and we'll say, hey, look, this money has been available and people will be able to take advantage of it. And so I feel a little guilty talking about Vermont because I'm in New York. But I think Vermont is a really interesting case study from a state perspective, partly because the state published this 10-year strategic plan about how to develop these regional food hubs and how to really build a vibrant agricultural economy in Vermont. And they've gone so far as to equate economic development in the state with developing new food systems. And if you look at these little statistics, economists love statistics, almost 20% of the jobs, 1 out of 5, are food related, and 13% of businesses, again, are food related. And so the goal of the state, as they put forth in this study, is to increase economic development, therefore food systems, create jobs, and improve access to healthy food. And so they have some stated goals in this. They want to increase the use of Vermont food in public institutions. I kind of have issues, and I'm sure you do, when you think about a state promoting a state's food, because regional food systems are probably going to be much more dynamic and sustainable than a state food system. But that's just the politics of the world. They're talking about matching retiring farmers with new farmers, so there could be this land transfer. And they're talking about making these pretty innovative things where they'll have regional food centers, where there'll be community kitchens, so you can come in and use the kitchen, either individually or on a larger scale, so you can add value to food. And they're building new facilities for aggregation centers, and they're focusing on helping farmers with their marketing. And marketing's been a problem for farmers forever, ever since there was a farmer and a market. So here's there's a lot of stuff here, but the 2 most interesting points are, one is the cellars at Jasper Hill. So Vermont is a dairy state. And so, how do you add value to dairy? You make it into really expensive cheese, right? So the cellars at Jasper Hill is just this nice notion, because you can take your cheese, you can take your milk, turn it into cheese, whoever you are, you can take it as green and go put it in the cellars at Jasper Hill and let it ripen. So that's the perfect way to set up this community way to add value to a product, because it's costly for one particular cheese maker to develop these cellars, so there's a central place. And I think that's been very successful. Of course, the downside of that is it's really expensive cheese, so it sort of misses the mark on food access, but in a way, you have to start somewhere, and if you're going to start somewhere, you should start with a product that people will buy. So I think that's the argument for starting with very high-value products. And the other area where I think Vermont really excels is in the farm-to-school program. I think that compared to other states, they have really integrated local food into the schools to the extent that they harvest all summer and they process food, they bake zucchini bread, and they take in-season stuff and they cook it in the summer and they save it and they serve it in the schools throughout the school year. And I think that's a model that, of course, requires a lot of equipment, but I think it's something that if you're looking at food quality in schools and trying to bring those links between local food and schools, they have certainly developed a program that's worth looking at. Okay, so why is Vermont so successful? I think Vermont might have an institutional framework that's set up that just makes it more likely that it will be successful. Agriculture is a big part of the state. Most of the people live in a rural area. There are very few urban jobs. So, if you're going to build jobs, you're going to build them in agriculture. Organic farming has strong roots in Vermont. I mean, it was one of the states where the early organic farmers set up. So I think that there's just been this notion of embracing all things alternative and sustainable and better for the world in the state anyway. The University of Vermont has been really active in the agricultural sector, probably better than a lot of other schools with extension programs. And there are a lot of food businesses in the state, a lot of cheese ones, but there are still food businesses. And the state and local support for agriculture is very high. So I feel like they have a lot of the pieces put into place that make it, more successful. But what does that mean for New York? Okay, so I've only lived in New York for a year, so I could definitely have things wrong, and I'm sure you'll let me know. So, I think that the areas where New York has potential really would be vegetables and dairy. There's a rising interest in farming. I think I even I have a food studies student who had some high-paying job, and she quit to become an organic farmer, and she and her husband bought a farm up in Utica, and they're working on developing that farm. So you have a lot of people that are interested in farming in New York, and they want to move, stay here and farm. And you have a thriving urban farming sector. Even if it's not very profitable, I think it's educating people and showing the different possibilities. Boy, and the consumers are really highly motivated. Although I kind of think those consumers might live in the city. I'm not so sure that the consumers outside of the city are as motivated. And so the challenges, though, I think New York has a couple of challenges that you really can't get around. Agriculture is not as much of the culture in the state, I think, as it is in Vermont, although there certainly are places where it is a big part of it, like around Ithaca and the Hudson Valley. And land is really expensive, so that automatically makes setting up distribution centers a much costlier activity than in a place like Vermont, where land values are low. And so the question is, how do you find an affordable site? And how far will that be from your urban market? How is that piece going to fit together? I don't know the answer to that, but that's something that certainly needs to be looked at. And this is the part where I just don't know. Is New York State and New York City really supportive of developing a really thriving regional food system? I don't know. You can look at these plans, and the plans say yes, but economists joke about stated preference versus revealed preference, or like actions speak louder than words. That's the layperson version of that. I'm not sure. And so I just have one last thing to say about the benefits of a regional food system. The thing is, the environmental benefits of a regional food system really are not guaranteed unless a lot of the new production is organic. Organic farming has been shown to reduce a lot of the negative damage caused by producing food. And so this whole IPM, sustainable food system, I don't know. I'd feel better if more of them were organic. That's all I'm saying. Just because it's local and regional doesn't mean that it's less environmentally damaging. I guess that's my main takeaway point. And this food miles argument that people give, I think, can be weak. There are studies that have shown that just because something is produced near you, it doesn't mean that the food miles means it has a lower carbon footprint. And there is a potential for increased farmer profit, particularly for small and medium-sized farms. Regional food systems, I think, would make them more viable over the long run. You have the potential for job growth through the creation of these regional food hubs. And probably not most importantly, but certainly most importantly from my perspective, because I'll never be a farmer or an intermediary, is, we'll all have access to better food. So that sums up my talk. And if anyone has any questions. Yep.
I have a question of why there's an assumption that if you target the top, sometimes it's going to get down to anyone below that.
Well,
because I think what you're doing is eating the ability, whatever area in economics, of the middle and certainly the bottom to get in, change the whole price structure.
Well, you want me to stand it here? Okay. I'm not suggesting that there will be like a trickle-down effect. I'm just saying that setting up a regional food system or a regional food hub is a complex process because you have all these different players and it's doing business in a whole new way. You have a lot more room for mistakes if you're selling a high-value product. So I would argue that ideally you start in an area where you're pretty sure you'll have a market with more affluent people who are willing to pay for it, and you get the system set, and then you apply it on a broader scale. So, I mean, you're right. There is no, you can't just assume that there'll be this trickle-down thing. I think it has to be like a, I think like you need like a business plan. If you really want to set up, say, regional food hubs that would serve the New York area, you know, and this is probably one reason why it's hard now to look at. There's a whole bunch of individual movements, but there's not a lot of coordination. So I think if you were really to do something like that, you would want to put in a business plan and set things up so that you could have like roll it out in particular phases, which again calls for a lot of money and probably support from, you know, a city or state or federal government. Have I convinced you?
No, I would just suggest if you looked at it the same as a high-value white-collar position, which does not have to be in the local area, can be separated by a continent because of computers and telecommunications. In law, in hard sciences, in advertising, in parts of medicine, in accounting, etc. If you were going to then say that, you would stop having any investment, you know, in colleges and universities to produce professionals. And I think that this concept has to be rethunk of, well, if the top 10% get it, then we've done everything like that. What happens to the other 90%?
No, I mean, I agree with you. I don't think it's like, it's great that Jasper Hill has the cellar, but you ideally want to see it go onto a broader scale. And the fact is, we all have to eat. So ultimately, it's not like there isn't a market. So, I mean, I get your point.
My name is Tristan Peer. I'm from New Jersey. I am not from New York, sorry.
That's okay.
My father owns a kitchen business. And a statistic when it came up to us, and it was apparent, that every person takes at least 2 of their daily meals in their car. That's pretty good for McDonald's, Burger King. And,
except people who live in Manhattan.
Except people who live in Manhattan. My point is that with this potential increase, as you have pointed out, that if you can reach 90% of people who eat daily food, who actually make dinners themselves, who actually sit down, have a family meal, and introduce the livelihood and the education that should be brought into us as from ages from 2 to 13.
Right.
And I think that change and that system that is affected in the local markets can be brought into our schools. You know, I wrote down the farms to schools. I was raised in Montessori, and so which is a school that looks at the farming aspect of life and the cultural intermediate education grouping. My question to you is then, how do you? I know you said you didn't have an answer for it, but what's the first step that you would like to see America take in globalization of great, better food for the common man?
Oh, I mean, to me, that's easy. I think I would come down on the big agribusiness companies. I hold them responsible for the current state of our food system. So I mean, I feel like they've been allowed to exert market power, particularly over the suppliers. And so, I mean, if I could like just dismantle them, I mean, that would be my wish. If I could do anything. You didn't ask me if it was practical, but. It's true. That's they're the villain.
Practical or not practical? Sorry.
Practical or non-practical, I think that is the ultimate goal. But replacing them, I think would be that step. In my mind's eye.
Right, but I would argue that there's no way you'll be able to replace them while they exist. It's just not going to happen. They have seized control. That's my opinion. I could be wrong. I'd love to be proven wrong, but I feel like I don't think like a market-based approach is going to come in and just change the food scene in a way that puts them out of business. Maybe someone disagrees. Do you disagree, Fabio? You're an economist.
No.
Yeah.
I'm very. I'm looking forward to see what happens with the new farm bill.
Yeah.
And that's going to be quite crucial. Just this morning on the New York Times, there was an article that was hinting at the fact that some of the subsidies will be erased. Now, how will that impact agribusiness? I'm not sure, because we're talking about farmers and they are not necessarily
Right.
the same. But I think in the next 2 years, that point is going to be one of the big battle points for the new farm bill that is being discussed.
Right. I mean, I think that's true, but I don't completely buy into the fact that agribusiness firms have their power because of subsidies. I think they might pay farmers a little bit more, but I think that they'll still monopolize, not monopolize, but oligopolize the system. I don't know, but you're right. It will be interesting to see. And plus, they'll get rid of all of our conservation programs, too. Yay, right?
Given that, I mean, doesn't that give more strength to the small individual movements that are bubbling up from what one would say would be the grassroots level? Because if we're trying to do it from the top down, you know, we have such a calcified system from the top down that maybe all the movements that we're talking about coming from below are going to really be what changes our food system. And I think that one thing that's missing from your paradigm here could also be the strength of food co-ops. I'm a member of the Park Slope Food Co-op, for example, and they're growing around the city. There are a lot of little movements in Fort Greene, in Bed-Stuy, in Bay Ridge, in Flatbush, and so forth. You know, it's sort of, so I'm thinking that, you know, I'd like you to respond to that potentiality.
Okay, well, the first thing is the individual movements are really important in several ways. One, there's the sense of empowerment. People feel that they can do things differently, and we have evidence here of people in ethical businesses that are making money. Maybe I shouldn't just assume you're ethical, but I'll just call it ethical for, just, you know, because you know what I'm talking about. But I do think they also raise consumer awareness, and so I think actually, in my mind, I visualize this regional food system that sits alongside of our conventional food system, and that it will capture some of the consumers from it. So I think and I think the way those regional food systems will develop will be it has to be some melding of these individual movements to bring the kind of power that you're talking about that comes from, say, a consumer cooperative, but it has this power, you know, at the business level. So they'll be sort of competing, but sitting next to each other, but maybe one won't have the ability to knock the other one out. Because there still are people who are going to buy the cheap food. I mean, you know, it's like, I don't think they're going to go away. I mean, Walmart is going to still sell a lot of food.
All right, I'd like to...
Wages, I'm sorry, I mean, I just think that goes to wages and people being able to make a living wage to be able to afford the food more than just the cheap food.
Right, but I think there are parts of the country actually where Walmart might be the only food store. I guess that's what I'm saying, is like, we look at the world through the New York lens, and we are pretty privileged in that we have a lot more options. So, but I think you bring up good points.
Right, I'd like to thank Carolyn. This was very, very interesting and a perfect finish to our afternoon. And the conversation can continue. We have some local wine, we have some cheese. So I'd invite you to enjoy and keep the conversation going. Thank you so much.